Okay, hi guys. Please note that one of your colleagues has reminded you to turn off your phones. Otherwise, there may be some kind of mass hysteria that I'm not going to be part of. Isn't your test scheduled for the Monday when you return from fall break? Okay, which means that I told you guys I wasn't going to give you guys a quiz while you were still taking the lab practicals, but you need a nervous system quiz. So what I'm going to do is over the weekend or maybe by next Monday, I will post a nervous system quiz for you on Top Hat Online that you guys can do. You can do it open book if you want to. I don't really care. I just want you to have the opportunity to actually see the questions. Don't cheat though, because that's a jackass move, and we all know that, right? So just like miss it on your own or get it right on your own. It doesn't make any difference. I just want you to see the questions, right? So we are going to start nervous system today. Nervous system is my very, very favorite part of anatomy. It's also, I think, the hardest part in lecture for students. I'm really good at teaching it though, because I started out really bad at teaching it, and then I just kept fixing it until I finally got it. So I'm going to get better next year, but this is the best I've ever been. So I think that, and this is totally subjective, but I think that in lab, the hardest part is muscles. And I think that in lecture, the hardest part is nervous system. Okay? So, to me. Why? Let me tell you, I think why nervous system is hardest is because you come into anatomy having had a decent amount of experience with, for instance, bones and muscles. Like, you know what this one's called before you got to anatomy, didn't you? Didn't you know it was called the femur, right? And since all of us decide we're going to be hot every once in a while, we know that, this is the deltoid, right? And we know that this is the biceps brachii, right? And we know that these are your glutes, right? So we have some background knowledge of muscles, but mostly people have zero background knowledge of nervous system terminology. So you have to just humble yourself and realize that you probably don't know the terms yet, and you have to make sure that you are critical of your knowledge of terms when you're studying this stuff. And I will give you plenty of opportunity to ask questions today. So we're going to start with the basic terminology of the nervous system today. Ask as many questions as you want, because if you don't get this, you won't get the next stuff and the next stuff. There are 6 chapters in the nervous system in your textbook. We don't do all 6. How do you know what to study? You use my notes as a guide to what to study. How did I pick? I did my favorite stuff, and then I did the stuff that I know that you're going to need for physiology or clinical programs, right? And something had to go, so I don't do a whole hell of a lot of sensory stuff, but I do a whole lot of brain function because I love that stuff. So use that as a guide and realize that I'm not going to test you on anything that isn't directly in your notes or I tell you to read from your notes, right? That makes sense? Okay, so we're going to start on chapter 14, and chapter 14 is basically the nervous system tissue and nervous system terminology. So first, let's start by talking about what the nervous system does for you. Let's divide it into 3 discrete steps and realize that it can get a hell of a lot more complicated than that. But this is the 3 basics. So your nervous system basically does 3 things for you. It does sensation. Sensation is information in, yeah? Okay, that's sensation, information in. It does integration, and integration is figuring out what, if anything, needs to be done about that information you just took in, like assessing and analyzing that information. And then it sends information out if a response is necessary. So let's use a super, super simple example, like a reflex after putting your hand on a hot stove. So you put your hand on a hot stove. Your primary function of your nervous system, along with your endocrine system, is to maintain homeostasis and keep you alive, right? Endocrine system helps as well, but it's way slower because it has to go through your bloodstream. Nervous system is really fast. 250 miles an hour down an axon is how quickly the impulses go. So I'm going to put my hand on a hot stove, and I'm going to send information in. That is called sensation, yeah? Sensation, by going in, I mean going toward the central nervous system. But I haven't solved the problem yet, correct? I just sent the information in. What has to happen in the central nervous system, either in the brain or the spinal cord, I have to compare that sensory input with like the ideal situation. So if I'm assessing temperature, I categorize hot. I assess how hot. Is it an error signal that's way bigger than I want it to be? And I say it's too damn hot, right? If it is too damn hot, then a response is necessary. Does that make sense? Okay, so I did integration in the central nervous system, which is to assess what I just brought in. And then if necessary, I actually do motor response by sending it out. And the motor response would be information out, and it would go out to the tissue that could solve the problem. In this particular instance, what tissue can solve the problems? Skeletal muscle. Can send it to my biceps brachii, right? And move it, right? So sensation, integration, and response. Now, can your sensations, integrations, and responses get way the hell more complicated than that? Yeah, this morning when your alarm rang, that was a sensation going in, right? Your integration was like, I am so damn tired. I don't want to do this, man. And your like integration was like, well, I already paid for this class, or somebody did. I already paid for this class. Oh, they paid for it for you, by the way. I already paid for this class, or it's too late to drop, or I don't want to be a failure, or McDonald's doesn't suit me, whatever, right? That's all your integration. And then ultimately your response was, apparently, because you're here, getting your butt out of your bed, brushing your teeth, we hope, right? Brushing your teeth, putting on some deodorant, right? And getting your clothes on and getting to class. So sometimes the integration is really complicated, but it's still just an extrapolation of sensation, integration, and response, right? Okay, so today what we are going to do is we're going to talk about the basics of the nervous system, how you do this, the parts, the structures, and the terminology. FYI, ain't nobody knows this terminology before they go through this, myself included. It was as hard for me as it is for you. Just realize it's one of those things that's not going to go away. Do you remember the first time somebody taught you cellular respiration and you were just like, wah, 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 wah. Eventually they're going to shut up about cellular respiration? And they literally never do, ever, even through graduate school. Same damn thing. These terms will never leave you. They're all the way through physiology, and they're in clinical programs. So you're going to have to get them over with early, okay? So we're going to start first with just the structural organization of the nervous system, and this stuff is simple. I mean, the structure isn't really simple, but the basics are simple. So first thing is, here's your central nervous system, which is badass. I want to do this dissection, and if any of you guys are super clever and creative and can figure out how to keep the nerves from becoming brittle, if I get it all out of there. Because I need it to be bendy and flexible, because what I want to be able to do is, like in lab, stretch it out on the table so that you guys can like touch it and bend it, right? But they always get crispy. So I like need to figure out how to like plastinate it or rubberize it or something. I haven't figured it out yet. So first, the big division is central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. And you guys all probably know that the central nervous system only has two structures in it, and they are what? Brain and spinal cord. And it is central, right, to the story. So the central nervous system is exclusively the brain and the spinal cord. All other nervous tissue is considered part of the peripheral nervous system. Yes? And peripheral implies what to you? Implies sides, right? So the peripheral nervous system you're seeing here. Now, the central nervous system is complicated. We'll get into it in the next set of notes. But for right now, let's just talk about it simply. The central nervous system is mostly where your cell bodies of your neurons are sequestered. And it is a really good place to keep your cell bodies, because what happens to your cell bodies if they die? Do they ever come back? No. They are almost all amitotic, right? So keeping them sequestered within the central nervous system, which is surrounded by bone, right? And then has fluid, and then has 3 layers of membranes surrounding it. That's a really good place to keep your precious amitotic tissues, right? So almost all of your neuron cell bodies are in the central nervous system. It's also got a bunch of glial cells and other stuff in there. So the CNS, the brain is located in the what cavity? Cranial. And the spinal cord is located in the spinal or vertebral. Either one is correct. So let me give you a preview of what actually the nervous tissue is made of in the central nervous system. You kind of already introduced yourself to it, and you said that, okay, if I look at nervous tissue, it might look like this. I have primarily neurons and glial cells, right? That's what I have. And so what you are going to see in a lot of detail in the next set of notes, but a preview for right now, is that the central nervous system is primarily composed of what we call gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is wherever you have a whole bunch of neuron cell bodies and glial cells supporting it. And white matter is wherever you have wiring between the gray matter. So stick with me for a second. So one of the things that you may have heard before that's true-ish but not true is that you left brain, right brain functionality. Now there's a little bit of truth to that, okay? In 80% of us, for instance, our visual spatial imaging is mostly in the right cerebral hemisphere, this side, okay? In 80% of us, our language capacity is in the left cerebral hemisphere. So if I were to look at an image and then try to describe it to you, I would have to use both, right? Yes? If I were, for instance, to look at a map, but then I have to describe to you where something is on a map, I'd have to use both. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to get information from here to here, yes? So what I'm going to need is I'm going to need wiring to go between the two of them. What is the wiring? It's primarily myelinated axons going between the halves, and usually it's white because myelin is white. So I have gray matter that would look like that histologically, and this is a badass, cool picture of the white matter in the brain. An artist made a space-filling image of the white matter of the brain. This is all the wiring in your brain. This is the white matter of your brain. The white matter in your brain we'll get into in more detail in the next set of notes, but primarily what you have is sets of white matter that go left to right, yeah? Front to back, and up to down, right? And sort of everything in between, right? So what that primarily is if the neuron is over here but needs to communicate with a neuron over here, it sends a myelinated axon across. Bundles of those myelinated axons within the central nervous system are what you're seeing right here, and they are called tracts or pathways. Tracts or pathways within the central nervous system. So the gray matter is the neurons and the glial cells, and the white matter is the wiring, right? So if you think about a computer, right, you've got your processors, you've got your wiring between your processors. Your processors would be your neurons, and the wiring would be the axons, the myelinated axons, okay? So does that make sense to you guys? You got it? Okay. So now, the central nervous system and the whole sensation and motor activity. Every single sensation that you ever have has to get to the central nervous system for integration. Otherwise, why sense it? Does that make sense to you? You, however, do not have to be aware of all of them. You are only consciously aware of a very few of your sensations. For instance, right now, you are sensing your own blood pressure, and you are sending it to your central nervous system via a sensory pathway, right? You are not consciously aware of doing that. You don't need to be consciously aware of doing that. However, if your blood pressure was too high, you would also do a motor response to, for instance, vasodilate to bring it back down, right? You are only aware of sensations that go to the most superficial 4 centimeters of your cerebral cortex. That's all you're aware of. Everything that happens anywhere else in your brain, you are completely unaware of. Your entire you, your entire consciousness and voluntary activity is only the most superficial 4 centimeters of your brain. That's it. Okay? So every single sensation you have goes to the CNS. Now, this one I'm aware of, right? That means it's going to my cerebral cortex, right? The fact of my blood glucose level, I'm not aware of it, but it's going somewhere else to my central nervous system. Good? Go ahead.
So my brother, he's diabetic, and so he's gotten to the point where he can kind of tell how much insulin he needs. Is that something? So is that like an awareness that you gain, or is that like?
What it happens is, so your sensory responses. So with my blood, I can actually tell when my blood glucose is low too, but it's primarily because I'm used to the feelings that go with low blood glucose. I'm not actually detecting my blood glucose levels, but I know that when I'm too stupid to work a doorknob, right, and really pissed off at everyone, right, it probably means my blood glucose levels are high. So what he ended up getting used to is the detectable conscious responses and what they were associated with. So he just basically taught himself about his body. And as you get a little older, you start feeling that, right? You're like, I definitely do not need any more, I don't need another glass of wine, right? I don't need another glass of wine. I can tell, right, that I don't need another glass of wine. I do need some sleep, right? I mean, you don't usually listen when that happens. You're like, need. All of those kinds of things you can tell when you're exhausted. You can tell when you are too stressed out. So he's basically just taught himself to map those conscious sensations to like his body stuff. And usually people who are really well-regulated diabetics will teach themselves that. Okay, now motor activity. All motor activity comes from your central nervous system, but this is humbling to me. I don't know why this was a big thing for me to understand. All motor activity comes from your central nervous system, but you are only in voluntary control of a single tissue in your entire body. One tissue is all you can control. What is it? Only skeletal muscle. You can't even control your own damn brain. Have you ever tried to tell yourself not to be anxious? How well does that work? You're like, it's making me more anxious because everybody now knows I'm crazy, right? So you are only in voluntary control of skeletal muscle. And even then, not all the time, right? You can't hold your breath to death. It's not going to work, right? Okay, so this is all going on, and most of it is going on without your permission or your knowledge, right? All of it. Okay, now, the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything that is not central nervous system, so we can look at it like this, right? All of this is peripheral nervous system. Or you can look at it like this picture from your textbook. So what is out there? What kind of nervous tissue is out there? First of all, there are very few neuron cell bodies because that's not a very safe place to put them. Yes? There are a couple little blobs of them here and there. They're called ganglia when they exist, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But mostly what's out there is just wiring. And the wiring is basically hooking up the sensory receptor that tells me when I'm hot to send the information through the wiring to my central nervous system to do the integration, yeah? And then the wiring that goes back to my biceps brachii, but no actual cells in most of the pathways. So most of these are nerves. They are primarily just wiring and hardly any cell bodies at all. So there are relatively few neuron cell bodies in the PNS. When they occur, they're called ganglia, but most of the PNS is actually called a nerve. So let's look at a nerve, and so you can figure out what it is. This is the biggest nerve in the body. Who knows what it is? The sciatic nerve. If you get sciatic nerve wrong on the nervous system lab, you should probably flunk, because it's honker. It's like that big. So this is the sciatic nerve. Let's take a cross-section of it and look at what it's made of, okay? So what is the sciatic nerve actually made of? So if you take a cross-section of the sciatic nerve, let's look at what a nerve is. So what a nerve is, you guys know what a neuron is, right? And here's what I want you to get out of this little spiel that I'm about to go through. That a neuron is not the same as a nerve, and you can't use them interchangeably. So you know what a neuron is, right? Here's a neuron. Right? Axon. Which direction is information going through this one? It's going that direction. Okay. Here's an axon. Do you remember that axons tend to be myelinated? Yeah? And myelinated is basically just this insulation that makes things move more quickly through them. Okay. What a nerve is a bundle of myelinated axons. Does that make sense? The neuron is actually not part of the nerve. So here's another neuron with an axon, right? And here's another one with an axon. So that sciatic nerve that is it's actually going to innervate my foot, my little toe. It's going to branch and innervate my foot and my little toe. The neurons that are actually controlling the activity to my foot and my little toe, they are not in the nerve. They're up here in the lumbar region of my spinal cord. Okay, so they're protected. So the only thing that's going through the nerve is actually this myelinated axon that allows me to send the signal out. Does that make sense? Okay, so the nerve is actually just a bundle of myelinated axons. And since it's running through the body, it needs layers of protection around it. So what I want to do is look at that nerve real quick. Ready? Here's one axon. Let's pretend that axon is this axon. Ready? And the neuron is not in that nerve. You're not going to see it, the neuron cell body. It's going to be up here. The axon is, and the axon is got a myelin sheath around it because that makes it increase the speed of transmission. But then it's not very protected. So what we need to have is layers of protection around each of those. And it's going to be a pattern that's familiar to you. Immediately superficial to the axon, we're going to run into our first layer of connective tissue, which is called endoneurium. Yeah? Then we're going to take a bundle of those axons, each of which is protected by endoneurium. And we're going to make it into a bundle of axons called a what? The bundle is called a what?
Fascicle.
Fascicle. Yes? And then we're going to wrap the fascicle in another layer of connective tissue called perineurium. And then we're going to take all of those fascicles and wrap them all in a connective tissue called what? Epineurium. Epiperiendo. Same pattern that you had before. Right. That makes sense? There's blood vessels running through it and stuff too. Now, let's go back to, do you remember what a bundle of axons was called? The wiring in the brain, what's that called? The wiring in the brain. It's called a tract. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to why the tract doesn't need layer after layer after layer of connective tissue around it? It's in the brain, already protected. So what's the big difference between a tract and a nerve? Tract is CNS, doesn't need any more protection, doesn't need layer after layer after layer of connective tissue around it. Nerve is running through the periphery and does. Yeah? Okay. They're both white though, because of all of the myelin around them. Okay. And as a matter of fact, when you look in the skull and the cadavers, the nerves tend to be a little yellow. They're kind of yellow. They just preserve yellow. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So this is what a nerve is. Now let's look at a nerve a little closer with like a histology. This is a scanning electron microscopy slide. So this is a scanning electron microscopy slide. Cross-section of a nerve, same thing. So if we look up super duper close, we can see an axon there. And then notice the white around the axon. That is actually the myelin sheath. Notice the stuff that's just superficial to the myelin sheath, like right around there. That's the endoneurium. Got it? It's not white. Notice this bundle. What's this bundle called? Fascicle. And then the fascicle is wrapped in perineurium. And we can't see the whole nerve, but if we could, the outside of the whole nerve would be wrapped in what? Epineurium. That makes sense? That's what a nerve is. Okay. Now, so now let's name the nerves and then we'll talk about function. So if we go back and say, okay, if our central nervous system is where all sensory information comes to and all motor information comes from, does it make sense that in order to get into the central nervous system, you're going to have like an on-ramp or off-ramp, right? So think about your central nervous system as like I-15, right? And you need to get to your little freaking driveway in Payson, right? You're going to have to get onto an on-ramp or off-ramp to the highway eventually, right? Okay. So no matter how much branching goes on with nerves, and they make teeny tiny little branches to every single little finger and every single little part of my eye, but there are a limited number of on-ramps and off-ramps to the central nervous system. There are 12 pairs of what we call cranial nerves, and the cranial nerves go directly to and from the brain. Do you see these? You will learn all of their names and functions eventually, but not right now. Okay. The cranial nerves, you've actually learned some of the holes that they go through already. You've learned, for instance, the optic foramen, where the optic nerve goes, right? You've learned the cribriform plate, where the olfactory nerves go through. Once you get to lab, not this week, but once you do the brain lab, what you will do is you'll start to put those structures that you learned before together with these new structures and functions that you're learning right now. And you'll, for instance, be able to figure out which hole I go through in the skull to control the movement of my eyes. That makes sense? Which hole the oculomotor nerve goes through, okay? But you're not going to do that right now. You'll do it a little bit later. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Those are the on-ramps and off-ramps to the brain. And there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Those are the on-ramps and the off-ramps to the spinal cord, okay? And if you don't go to or from one of those, you are never going to communicate to the central nervous system or from the central nervous system. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, go ahead.
What was so the 12 pairs of the cranial nerves on and off nerves of the
Brain.
brain, and then the 31 pairs are on and off nerves.
Spinal. Does that make sense to you guys? So they are called cranial nerves and spinal nerves, and we'll learn cranial nerves and spinal nerves in some more detail. The cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs. They are numbered, Roman numerals 1 through 12, and they all have individual names. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves, they don't have individual names. They're just named for where they come out of the spinal cord. Like there's a cervical set, and there's a thoracic set, and there's a lumbar set, and a sacral set. So they're not as hard as they initially would seem. Okay? All right. So those are cranial and spinal nerves. Every other nerve in the body came to or from one of those. Has to, right? And you don't learn a ton of the other nerves, but you'll learn some of them. Okay. So now I want to talk about functionality of nerves. And that's where we're really going to get this. Okay? So with functionality of nerves, first off, we have to look at a nerve and figure out which direction information is flowing through it. If, for instance, stick with me, there was a muscle out here, and the nerve only carried information from the central nervous system to the muscle, then that nerve would be considered motor. Does that make sense to you? Like all of its functionality is motor. Yeah? If, however, this was the central nervous system and these were sensory receptors, and it was exclusively carrying information toward the brain, then that nerve would be considered sensory. Yes? Does that make sense? Okay? But nerves can be mixed, and most of them are. So what if in this same nerve, I had a neuron that was sending information that direction, then can you see that this nerve would be mixed in function? Now, this can get confusing because a single neuron cannot be mixed in function. A neuron has to decide what it's going to do, and then it does that for the rest of its damn life. Dendrites in, axon out, right? But a nerve is really packaged, and it can have both sensory and motor axons in it. So let's talk about that sciatic nerve again, okay? The sciatic nerve is already bundled and protected and going to my toe. Is there any reason that some of the axons in the sciatic nerve cannot be carrying sensory information from my toe, and some of them carrying motor information to my toe? Does that make sense? Most nerves in your body are mixed in function. Only a few are sensory or motor, because most nerves are really more about where they're going than what they're doing. And there's no reason that every single wire in a cable has to be doing the same thing. Does that make sense? Okay, so can neurons be mixed in function? No, but nerves can be mixed in function. This is why you cannot use those terms interchangeably. As a matter of fact, how many of you guys went to the teaching demos? Any of you guys? Okay, so in the teaching demos, we had them do nervous system. We had them do the autonomic nervous system in part because it's really hard. We wanted to see like how they would do with it. 3 out of the 8 use neuron and nerve interchangeably. And these are people with PhDs, DDSs, right? We had doctors. And guess which 3 did not get hired? Because it's something you really need to get down if you're going to teach the nervous system, right? Because it's a fundamental vocabulary misunderstanding. That makes sense to you guys? Okay, so that's neuron and nerve are not the same. All right, so now, does anybody have any questions?
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
So with the mixed nerves, you have at least 2 neurons. One to
The neurons are not in the nerves, but they're at either end of the nerve, right? Yeah.
So you have one that's coming from and one that's going to.
So if I said, for instance, and sensory neurons are weird looking, so just go with me and I'll explain what they actually look like later. If I was talking about that little toe business, the motor neuron that controlled the wiggling of my little toe would be up here in the lumbar region of my spinal cord. That's where the neuron cell body is, right? And then the axon from that one goes to my little toe. But the sensory neuron cell body is somewhere. It's not actually down here. But the axon of that one goes from there all the way up. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So now let's get to some terminology and let you guys play with these words a little bit and start using them and figuring out. Okay. So Now, instead of talking about structures for a second, we're going to talk about functions. We're going to talk about, go ahead.
Wait, so we both have this question. So neurons can't have both functions?
No. Mm-mm. A neuron must be either sensory or motor, or there's one other thing. It could be an integration neuron in the central nervous system, but it can't be both. So when an axon sends information, it's exclusively unidirectional. One direction, okay? And we'll get back to that once we start talking about neurons and different categories of neurons. Go ahead.
So do neurons in the brain look different than neurons?
They do. Mm-hmm. So the only kind of neuron you've ever seen is one that looks like that. It's a multifold neuron. There are different structural organizations of neurons. We haven't gotten to them yet, but once you get to those, you'll start to figure out like how a sensory neuron might be able to do that, how a motor neuron might be able to do something different. That's one of the reasons that I don't really like that when they teach you histology, they only teach you one look at histology, because it kind of gives you the false impression that they all look the same. But considering you learned, 26 histology slides, you didn't want to learn another one at that point, did you? So at this point, I'll teach you that they can actually look different. Okay, go ahead.
The sensory neurons, are they ganglia? Or are they actual neurons?
Ganglia is a collection of neurons.
So like, because you said that there's hardly ever any neurons in the penis.
You're not ready for that question yet. You hold on to that question. I mean, it's a great question, and you are ready for it, but we're not ready to answer it yet, so it'll probably come the next lecture. Okay, but it's an awesome question. Okay, so here we go. What we're going to do is do functional terminology now. So we're going to move away from just looking at a cross-section of a nerve, and we're looking at functionality. So first thing is, you guys can see that side better than they can see this side. Can you guys see that side of the board? Okay, I think that over there they have trouble actually seeing. Okay. Okay, so here we go. So I've got the CNS and the PNS. First question, one-way or two-way communication between them? CNS and PNS, one-way or two-way communication? Two-way communication. So I'm going to draw two arrows. Next question. Which of those arrows, top or bottom, gets the label sensory? Top. Everybody cool with that? And so the bottom one gets motor. Okay. And so what's going to happen is sensory information goes through the PNS to the CNS, and then it gets integrated. Yes? And then the motor information goes back out the CNS through the PNS. Yes? Okay? All right. So now we are going to look at PNS function. First off, please look, and this tells you something kind of clinically important. The CNS doesn't do anything but integration. It actually doesn't even have any sensation capacity. Did you guys know that they can do brain surgery with the person awake and no anesthetic actually on the brain? Because you have no sensory receptors on your brain. You also have no motor capacity on your brain. It ain't going to wiggle, right? Okay? It only does integration. That's all it does. Now, the bone will hurt like hell, right? They better anesthetize that part. And the PNS, for all practical purposes, does damn near no integration. It's a little bit, but we'll talk about that later. Pretty much no integration. It only does sensory or motor activity, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take the PNS and we're going to divide it functionally, and we're going to make one arrow going out, one arrow going in. And what we are actually building is something like this. Only when you build it, you'll actually understand it better than when you look at it. Okay? So what we are going to have is the PNS is going to be either doing sensory activity or motor activity. This arrow is going in, so this is going to be the sensory, or the other word that you need to learn is afferent. It's actually afferent and efferent, but they don't sound different enough. So I always say afferent and efferent, because I'll sound like a redneck. You all know I am anyway. Sensory or afferent division carries information toward the central nervous system. And then the other division is the motor or efferent division carries information away from the central nervous system. Does anybody have a way that they remember the difference between afferent and efferent?
I always remember things like if they aren't the way I
Afferent, I feel like A should go away, but it doesn't, so I remember that's what I'm going towards.
Don't listen to her, that's confuse the hell out of you.
Yeah.
Afferent approaches, efferent exits. But that's fine too. There are a couple things that I remember. But afferent approaches the central nervous system, efferent exits the central nervous system.
You just do it.
I just remember things like,
Exit, right.
if it doesn't make sense.
That sometimes that works for me too. But this one I actually figured out a way to make it.
Okay, well that
Makes
makes
sense.
way more sense.
Afferent approaches the central nervous system, efferent exits the central nervous system. And you do have to use those terms because by the time you leave anatomy and get into phys, they will almost never use sensory and motor anymore. Go ahead.
So what does the efferent take away from the central nervous system? What
It
does
takes
do?
action potentials. These electrical stimuli that we're going to talk about, so you won't really learn how an action potential works until you take physiology, but what happens is the axon, right, sends an electrical signal 250 miles an hour down the axon toward the end. And the efferent nervous system sends them this way, and the afferent nervous system sends them this way, right? And they go very quickly. Does that make sense? Okay. And they're kind of complex physiologically, and for those of you who've taken phys, you're like, hell yeah, they are. Later on, you can do that. You don't want to do them at the same time. Okay, so I've got sensory or afferent and motor efferent. Okay, so let's add a little bit more detail to this. The sensory or afferent is actually gathering information from sensory receptors. Okay, and the sensory receptors, you know what they are: touch, temperature, pressure, pain. Those are the general ones. And then you have your 5 special senses that you learned in kindergarten. Remember those? Vision, hearing, smell, taste, equilibrium. They call it balance when you're in kindergarten. Okay, so these are sensory receptors. There are 2 different categories of sensory receptors. Okay, depending on where they are located, your sensory receptors can be primarily associated with like the surface of your body, not exactly the surface, but you'll know what I mean when I show you the other one. And these are called somatic sensory. So just hold on to that for a second and I'll explain it. And then the other ones are senses that are mostly associated with your guts, which are called visceral sensory. Okay. Somatic sensory are sensations that you feel in your skin, your muscles, your bones, and a few other places. Yeah? Skin, muscle, it's in your notes too. Skin, muscle, bones, a few other places. You are usually aware of those. Okay? Not always, but usually. Visceral sensations are mostly associated with your guts. Think your abdominopelvic cavity, primarily. Sometimes you're aware of those and sometimes you're not. For instance, you can be aware of them when you have uterine cramps. You can be aware of them when you've got pain associated with diarrhea. You're not always aware of them, for instance, when your urinary bladder is full, but not so full that you feel like you're going to pee down your leg, right? So you may have awareness of those and you may not, okay? So these are called visceral sensations. They're gut sensations. Does that make sense to you? Go ahead.
Would hunger be the same thing?
Hunger is a visceral sensation, yes. Right? And sometimes you're not actually consciously aware of it, and then you are. You're like, I'm hungry. Oh, I'm super hungry, right? Does that make sense? So these are visceral sensations. So if I have an itch, what is it? What kind of sensation? Somatic sensation. If I get the squirts, the pain associated with squirts, not the squirts themselves. Visceral, go ahead.
So, you know, when you're on the roller coaster, drops
Visceral. Yeah. Hate roller coasters. Something about pregnancy, for those of you who are moms, like I can't go on rides anymore. I can't even swing. I'm like, that's why old people don't go on rides, because we gave birth to you humans and we gave up our rides.
That's I thought it was age. Pregnancy.
Ever since pregnancy, I can't go on anything, and hell no if it spins. I'd be like, no. Here's $30. Go on and find a friend. Okay, so there's another category. You guys ready? And then we'll do 2 examples. The motor or efferent division will go to what we call effectors. So we have receptors. Now we have effectors. Okay. Effectors are things that you can make wiggle or squirt. Wiggle or squirt. You got 4 wiggle squirt tissues. Let's see if you can come up with them.
Glands.
Glands. Those are the squirters. Go ahead. Muscle. 3 types though. Let's get them all. Skeletal. Smooth. Cardiac. Okay. So you can make things wiggle or squirt with the efferent nervous system because those are the effectors. You can effect a change with effectors. Yes? You have 2 branches of the motor or efferent division. And they are the somatic motor. And we're going to use some examples in just a second. And the somatic motor controls the only tissue that you have voluntary control of, and that is skeletal muscle. And so the other way of saying that is that skeletal muscle is the effector for the somatic motor division. Does that make sense? And the other 3 tissues are autonomous. Do you know that word? They do their own damn thing. Okay? So these are part of what we call the autonomic nervous system, also called the visceral motor. And those you can't voluntarily control, but they are being controlled. And they are the other 3, right? And so they are cardiac, smooth, and glands. So cardiac, smooth, and glands are the effectors for the autonomic nervous system. Go ahead.
So that'd be like sweating.
Mm-hmm.
And like
Yep.
oily stuff.
Yep. Can you control sweating? No. Otherwise, you would never sweat on a date or during a job interview, right? You never would, right? Right? Okay, so let's talk about 2 examples, and I want you guys to use the terminology. You will never learn it unless you use it. So let's do 2 examples. I get an itch, and I scratch it. And I want you to use all the correct words in the correct orders to get me through it. I get an itch. What type of sensation is that? Somatic sensory. You have to use sensory because there's a different kind of somatic. It is somatic sensory, and it goes through the what ferent branch? Afferent branch of my what part of the nervous system? Peripheral nervous system. To the central nervous system for integration, and it's itchy enough that I want to do something about it. So I go back through the central nervous system and out through the what ferent branch of the peripheral nervous system? Use the ferent, efferent branch of the peripheral nervous system. To which part? Somatic motor. To which tissue is the effector? Skeletal muscle. Got it? Okay. Now, I'm going to eat some super spicy Thai food that is way out of my comfort zone. Right? I'm going to try it. I'm going to do a 5 when I know I'm a 2 kind of girl. And I'm going to get the squirts because of it. Okay? So, super spicy Thai food. Sensation is what kind? Visceral sensory in my guts, yes? Visceral sensory goes through the what ferent branch of the peripheral nervous system? Afferent branch of the peripheral nervous system to the CNS for? Integration. And my body says, you are not up to a 5. What the hell were you thinking? And then it sends information out through the what ferent branch of my peripheral nervous system? Efferent branch. To which side? Autonomic motor. To which tissue? Smooth muscle. Smooth muscle. To get it out. Hopefully, like in the bathroom. Have you guys ever been to Shannon Thai downtown?
Yes.
Oh, hell. Do not go for a 5. Heavens, no. I was like walking around. We went with my husband's boss. I had to like leave. It was terrible. I was trying to impress somebody. I don't know what the hell I was thinking. Okay. So this one, just briefly, has one further subdivision. I'm going to draw it over here. Okay. And this one we're going to go into much more detail about later. There's a set of notes about it, but I just want to introduce you to it. So the autonomic motor has a further subdivision which we will talk about in much more detail in the future. And the autonomic motor has a further subdivision, and that is that this is still a functional subdivision. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic. They both go to the same tissues. The effectors are still the same. Cardiac, smooth, and glands. But I have one hookup to skeletal muscle, and I can either tell it to contract or leave it the hell alone. But with my heart, for instance, I can either actively tell it to speed up or actively tell it to slow down. So instead of having just a stimulator hooked up to it, I've got a gas pedal and a brake hooked up to the heart. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so let's talk about when you would use these things. Go ahead.
So your kidneys, I assume, would be using like the visceral motor.
Yes.
What about if your kidneys are on dialysis? What then?
Your kidneys are not very much controlled by your nervous system. They're primarily controlled by your endocrine system.
Oh, okay.
So we do talk about dialysis and fizz. You guys need to get Greg to let you guys take fizz. Yeah, so you could need to see if you can like get him to figure out how to work. It's more important for you than psychology. They just made all that crap up anyway. That's not real science. Okay, so the sympathetic branch. So I want you to think about your heart for a second because everybody knows where the hell it is and what it should do. Why don't you think about your heart? Right now, you don't have a quiz. You don't have a test. There's not a tiger in the room. Your heart rate can be relatively low and still accomplish homeostasis, correct? Tiger walks into the damn room, right? You have entirely different needs for your heart. First of all, if tigers ever get opposable thumbs, we are all screwed. But second, so we have different needs for our heart. So let's talk about the sympathetic is often called the fight or flight division. And that would control your heart when the tiger walked in. What do you think it's going to do to your heart rate? Just predict. Increase your heart rate, right? And the parasympathetic controls your heart rate all other times, like right now. So this is called the feed or breed division. So my physiology professor, who was more inappropriate than I am, believe it or not, because in Texas that's how we're charming, called the autonomic nervous system. It said that he said that the autonomic nervous system was in control of the 4 F's: fight, flight, feed, and breathe. You'll never forget, will you? You're like, inappropriate, Melanie. He was worse. His name was Dr. Gross. It was. And if you wore short enough shorts, you could pass that class, no problem. He was gross. Okay. So fight or flight, feed or breathe. So now, tiger walks into the room. I have different needs for my heart for homeostasis, right? I need to increase my heart rate. So what I would do is right now, Alex is sitting there. There's no tiger in the room. And his parasympathetic nervous system is actively slowing down his heart rate, right? Then tiger walks into the room. Parasympathetic stops, which makes the heart rate go up, but not enough because it's a tiger. And then the sympathetic increases it more, yeah? But here is the mistake that most students make, and that is that it will not increase the activity of all tissues, because now I want to think about not Alex's, but my uterus, and the tiger walks in. So I'm sitting here just being me, and I'm doing a little bit of uterine contraction, right? Just keeping blood flow, a little uterine contraction, and then a tiger walks in. So the parasympathetic nervous system, the feed or breed, would probably increase the activity of my uterus because I could afford it right then. But then when the tiger walks in, do I want to spend ATP on uterine contraction? I don't even care if I have a uterus. I would literally throw it to him if it would save me, right? And I'm done with mine anyway. I'm totally done, right? Like, you eat the damn uterus. So what it does is the sympathetic nervous system only increases the activity of tissues that would help in fight or flight situations because you have finite resources, right? you do not have infinite glucose and oxygen and blood flow. So what the mistake that people make is they think that the sympathetic nervous system increases everything, but then you burn up all your resources. It increases the things that would help and decreases the things that wouldn't. And sometimes it's wrong. Like for instance, in a job interview, sweating, big pit sweats, they don't help. But historically speaking, evolutionarily speaking, it's like, you're gonna get super hot, let me help you. Go ahead.
So is it triggered by like hormones, like adrenaline and stuff like that?
No, this is nervous. It will cause adrenaline release,
Okay,
but the nervous controls the hormones, not the other way around.
it will
Okay.
cause.
It will cause adrenaline release. If you get freaked out enough, then it says the nervous system release of neurotransmitters does not get me through 30 minutes of running away from a tiger. So how about I dump it into the bloodstream to make sure it lasts for long enough? That's like when you almost get into a car accident, right? And you're like, I almost got into a car accident. I dump adrenaline into the bloodstream because I thought it was a tiger, right? And then I figure out that I'm not going to die. And then can you calm down very quickly? No, you can't. You have to wait for it to actually get out of the bloodstream. So I'll see you guys on Friday.